Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. My name is John Kelly. I look after product management here at Contentstack. I'm told that I'll have some tech support in the background, letting me know if there's any questions, and if you guys can hear me okay, or if you need me to speak up or anything, so please just drop that into your chat, and I'll make sure to do that accordingly. Thanks for being here. Today, we're excited. We're going to have a look at actually a few things in Contentstack today. Specifically, we're going to take a look at our new interface. So we have a new Contentstack interface we've been developing over the better part of a year. It's live currently to all customers, as well as people who want to go give it a try out. We'll actually then dive a bit deeper into our new JSON-based rich text editor. We've been developing that specifically as well for our new interface. Going a bit deeper into that, specifically, I'll actually be demoing some new functionality for building custom plugins for the rich text editor itself. So that's some upcoming functionality that we're quite excited about, and I'll be showing some of the capabilities there and talk about what's possible. Without further ado, let's go ahead and just dive right in. All right, so as you should be able to see, this is basically intro to the new Contentstack experience, but mostly JSON RTE plugins. Cool, so I'm gonna jump between actually the slide deck as well as our kind of live web app here, just to do a quick demo between the two. Kind of two demos, basically, one over the new experience itself, and I'll talk about some motivations there, and then we'll go into a second demo for the JSON RTE plugins. As far as their motivations go for the new experience itself, the first and primary one is that headless, we can call it a revolution or an evolution, it was really driven by technology. It was really an exploration in technology. It wasn't really an exploration in user experience. You can make, of course, an argument in some ways that the headless systems are much more stable and therefore drives a better user experience. But more or less, it was actually an exploration in the technology itself. For this API first approach, and that wasn't so much an exploration or a drive forward to the user experiences that have been developed for editorial users and business users over many years, and in fact, even decades in some of the legacy and traditional CMSs. And as such, the pendulum kind of swung pretty far from the editorial side over to the developer side. It was sort of the first iteration of a lot of the headless systems. And sort of as, over time, now we're kind of getting to a point where our intention is that the pendulum really should be kind of having an equal share of user attention and attention from the development teams building these experiences. And to us, user experience is really key. So as technology increasingly sort of fades into the background, as the headless experiences and headless technologies get more sophisticated, as the users themselves get more sophisticated and expect a bit more from the systems that they're using, as technology advances in ways where a lot of the different sort of methodologies and frameworks and ideas that people have around where web technology is headed sort of are coalescing a little bit faster. So the changes are much more incremental. They're less of these bold shifts, and they're realized by everyone. So as soon as one school of thought does something that's fairly popular, other schools of thought tend to fall in line pretty quickly. And so increasingly as that tooling itself becomes also more sophisticated and more oriented towards the user, the technology tends to fade into the background. This happens, sort of during the hype cycle of a lot of new technologies anyway. And when that happens, really all that you're left with is the experience. And so that was kind of the underlying motivation for us to actually build our new experience here and really provide the best of both worlds for both the developer users as well as the editorial users. So with that, again, I promised it would be fairly quick here. Let's go ahead and do a quick demo of Contentstack. So I jumped into basically our new dashboards. This is just a vanilla instance of the new Contentstack experience. As for a very quick tour, the dashboard itself is sort of the homepage, the landing page for every user when they come into the application itself. The dashboard itself also is itself an extension point. And so Contentstack has several extensibility points throughout the platform and basically an app framework that can be used to extend the platform itself. The dashboard itself is one of those. So we sort of continue jumping on here. And again, this is very vanilla. I just took the liberty of creating a single content type and basically a single entry ahead of this. And I'll kind of go into the background, the story for that. This is our content entry repository. It contains all of your content across all of your entries. We then, of course, have our asset manager. which contains all of your assets, so basically all of your images and videos and audio files and documents and executable files and sometimes even code files as well. Our content types are basically our content models. Today we have two primary instances or versions of a content type. Content type itself is basically your standard content model, the scaffolding or the framework for your content. And then we have what are called global fields. And global fields are effectively a reusable snippets of a content type. And so you can basically create them once, reference them within a primary content type, and then manage those all from one individual place. And so whenever a global field is updated, any content type consuming that field, which is basically contains a snippet of additional fields, will be updated as well. Of course, we always have our publish queue, which is basically like an audit log, but for business users, so a little bit more business-friendly information. We, of course, have our releases queue, our task manager, and then basically all of our settings. Okay, if we jump back into here, I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick demo of our search experience. One thing you'll notice is that the entire application is hotkey enabled as well. So I've not basically added or touched the search bar with my mouse. I'm just go ahead and use the hotkey for it. And I'm just going to go ahead and start typing content. So out of everything that we've developed for the new Contentstack experience, search is probably the thing that changed the most. We've created what we would call like a pseudo syntax or like a highly structured query language to manage the search experience. Of course, on the back end, it's very similar. We made some pretty dramatic improvements to kind of the performance and to support this new language. Fundamentally, it is still fetching and allowing users to execute pretty highly complex and advanced queries for the content they're looking for. And I'm going to go ahead, instead of searching the string of content, I'm just going to go ahead and find the content type argument. And here I can see it equals stemma.rt because that's the only content type we have so far. But then I'll go ahead and further refine this and just say items that were updated by me. As soon as I run that query, of course, I'm just going to get dropped back into my entry repository and filtered by the single lone entry that I created. Nonetheless, it is a very powerful and excellent new search experience. A few things to notice as soon as we jump into the new entry editorial experience itself. Number one is our outline view. So basically allows, especially if you have a lot of fields, allows you to really quickly jump through each and every one of the fields that you might have within your entry. It'll actually include nested fields as well. So really, really quick way to navigate all of your sort of entry information, entry status, as well as any discussions that are currently happening. So of course, we do have sort of commenting feature at each and every field level will be present on the right-hand side, as well as you have the option to go into what we call focus mode, which is really just a nice way to really concentrate on the work that you're doing. Even further, kind of going into that level of focus is the ability to actually enter the RTE in like a full screen mode, really to go through and create that rich text without sort of losing track of where you're editing and actually sort of resembling a more holistic experience closer to the web page you're going to be ultimately publishing to. So this is our new RTE. So it is a very, my sort of default one, or the one that I've sort of created here. It's a very limited set of features, and I've done that very specifically because we're going to go ahead and extend this and actually create some new features. But I did want to just really briefly kind of showcase exactly what it means to create content in the RTE. So for example, we do have the option of adding additional forwarding functions. It does support like a markdown syntax. And so if I put a single hash, I can go ahead and say this is an H1. That'll basically create that single hash for me. A variety of other additional experiences and just basic formatting options are there for the user. And we're going to go ahead and just kind of get out of this and jump back over to, without too much delay, jump back over to our slides now. So that was a little bit on the new experience. I specifically wanted to dive actually deeper into the JSON RTE plugin architecture. And so I kind of talked about that just a minute ago. And within the JSON RTE itself, we do have sort of this document structure. And so the document structure for specifically the rich text field is kind of contained thusly. So the first thing is, and there's kind of 4 different element types that we have here. So the first one is basically a block level element. So a block is basically every new line within the RT itself is actually considered a block, and it's its own unique identifier. It's stored uniquely, and basically that field itself is assembled sort of on the fly when it's being requested. But those blocks have independent sort of attributes. They're independently sort of managed, and there's a lot of really good reasons for that, because everything that comes inside of the block, basically your text elements, your inline elements, and your void elements, all are referring to that UID for that block that they're inside of. And so next we have our text elements. And the text element, as you can see here in the middle in green here, is basically just your text string. And so you can apply some basic formatting to that. So, of course, I didn't do that in the screenshot, but could have applied my made it italicized. I could have applied some underlining to it. I could have applied some bold or strong text to it. A variety of things I could have applied basically to that text itself. Then it brings us to our inline element. Inline elements are basically some custom functionality that basically is contained within a block itself. And so in this case, it's basically a hyperlink, so a linking functionality, as you can see here in blue. That's an example of an inline element. And then finally, it brings us to our void element. And we call this a void element because basically it's an image in this case, so it's an asset from our asset manager, but it doesn't actually contain any text. And so it's not responsible, like the RT isn't responsible for actually modifying the data within that element itself. It's really just a placeholder for what might be placed inside of it. Therefore, it's to us called a void. So those are the four kind of element types that we manage today in Contentstack within the new JSON RTE. And we'll look at the output of this a little bit later as well. So let's talk about the essential properties here for plugins themselves. So again, I'm focusing this primarily on actually a plugin architecture. So I went over the document structure, but we want to talk about like the actual plugin architecture and the ability to extend the RT itself. And so the plugins themselves kind of run very similar to how the formatting options that you just saw would be structured. So of course they start off with an ID, and you can see basically I've sort of buried the lead a little bit and let loose the type of plugin that we're actually going to create here. We have element types, and so we talked about blocks, voids, inline, etc. And then we have attributes, and so attributes are things that can be applied to it's basically data and associated data to the block itself that the plugin will need or actually will generate. And so, if you can think of things here like a URL for example, a social embed, it might be font family or font color or font size if you're trying to create a custom plugin that manages some stylistic attributes. And so those are basically just attributes to the text itself. And then you have your components, and components are really important because one thing to remember here, and actually I kind of, I didn't go through a lot of this up front, but is that the Contentstack new user interface is actually built in React. And so it is built and maintained with a React storybook library, component library. And so effectively what you're doing when you are creating a plugin for the JSON RTE is you're actually building a React component. You're building a small little React app, in fact, and basically hosting that and letting Contentstack RTE consume that and let your editors actually use it. And so it's basically a React component it's basically representing the presentation layer for the component itself within the UI of Contentstack. And you have certain handler functions. And so you can apply some business logic basically to manage the interactivity. So, for example, on execute or on click, execute something and have other sorts of interactivity that's managed for the various functions within the RT itself. Okay, going further into the element types themselves, let's talk about blocks. And so blocks, block component basically starts a new line, as I said before. So it's basically a new paragraph. It is completely its own element that has its own unique ID and is stored separately and has its own sort of components that are inside of it. And so it uses effectively the full width of the page or the container that it's in. An example here would be just a basic paragraph tag, and you hit enter, and you basically have a new paragraph after that. You can see on the right hand side here effectively how what the object is contained as, and how it's basically going to be stored, and what the configuration options for the user are as well. So you can basically provide a type for it, certain attributes, as well as any sort of children that are necessary there, nested as, of course, arrays with their own IDs and their own elements inside of those. So this is actually where the power of JSON is kind of unleashed or sort of unlocked, I guess, because of course every block can have its own sort of nested elements within it, and the ability to control the data in that sort of nested fashion. And in fact, actually generate new data in a nested fashion as well. Awesome. And so now we get into the second type, and we talked about the three of these just a minute ago, but they're really what we would call leaves. And so you kind of have this concept of blocks and leaves, and the leaves themselves are kind of the subcomponents of the block, and live within that standard block. And so the three types here, once again, are sort of our inline, our void, and our text element. So inline elements really behave very similar to a block, but they typically don't occupy the entire full width, and they actually wouldn't necessarily force text onto new line. And so again, this is just like a link would be an example of one. A void element has no editable text, and so unlike block and inline, this would just be things like embeds for specific embedding a URL or embedding a particular object from a third-party service. Also dropping an image or a video, those would be void elements because they don't really have anything that's any text for the rich text editor to actually manage. Then you actually do have your text, and so text is really within a block, and it's actually just your basic your text-based content with standard formatting options available to it. And on the right-hand side here, when you're actually building your JSON plugin, you can actually see the sort of the way that you would structure your object to be maintained or managed by the end user themselves. Awesome. So let's get to a quick demo. Situation here, basically, and we'll just kind of go through a basic situation, problem, and solution. The company needs an editorial tool which allows a content manager to embed tweets within the flow of text in their article. The problem here is that there is no inbuilt social embed functionality in the CMS, though at least the one that user is using. So the solution here is let's build a custom plugin. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we might do that. So I'm going to jump over, and in fact, I'm actually going to re-share. So give me just one quick second here. All right, so let's go side by side here. And in fact, what we're seeing on the left-hand side is basically an instance of our boilerplate for the JSON RTE. So in fact, if I'm in our sort of plugin, so you'll notice there's what it kind of basically comes with is a source folder as well as a handful of useful packages or useful files. Of course, your basic sort of package.json, some other configuration files. Fundamentally, what we are writing this in is TypeScript, and we are building basically a React app. So of course, I actually do have, in order to run this, I am compiling this with Webpack, and in fact, I have some npm running as well. So of course, fundamentally, what this basically is you're building a React app that is being referred to by our JSON RTE. And so if I come over here and let's go ahead, I actually sort of pre-coded a handful of lines here. So there's really 5 steps you need to remember. And those 5 steps, the very first one, and we'll just do this kind of live as we go through this. So step number 1 is, so import app SDK. And so nice thing is about our boilerplate, this is what you were just looking at. We already did that for you. So step number 1 is basically done. Now we'll go to step number 2. And step number 2 is actually to initialize the app SDK. Oops. There we go. And in fact, we actually are including in our boilerplate itself an initialization and a rendering of the SDK itself, and basically providing us with or declaring a couple things here. So of course, we are getting ourselves an extension, and then we're actually basically providing you with the RTE plugin functionality as well. So this effectively is already done. Of course, this can be modified as needed, but let's go ahead and just actually now move on to step number 3, which is the most important, and that's basically just to go ahead and create and register the plugin itself. Awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag some things. I could have, we sort of built this earlier. I'm not going to go ahead and sort of type all the all the characters out here live, doing some live coding would just take a while, and chances are I might actually make a typo and we'd have to go through and debug that. So one thing I will just do is I'm just going to go ahead and grab my first block here. And in fact, let me just try that one more time. Actually, what I forgot to do, because there's a folder that contains some pre-built components as well. I'm going to go ahead and just grab the first 3 of these. All right. And the next thing I will do is, in fact, go ahead and just grab. There we go. That's what I was looking for. That should work a little bit better. And so we're basically done here. And by the way, for step number 1, I did import the app SDK. The only 3 things I added here are basically imports for the 3 files, TypeScript files that contain some of the functionality for the icon we're going to use for this, as well as the actual embed functionality itself. And then we're going to open up a little bit of a modal, and you'll see what that looks like here in a minute. Now, as we kind of move on here, we'll want to create and register our plugin, right? So this is step number 3 that we're now on. So once we have the components created, we'll be able to actually use the plugin file here, basically to declare various details and configuration options for our plugin. So things like name, ID, where the RT is displayed. So we have a basic toolbar. So I'll go ahead and just say, for example, the icon name is that we're going to use here is social embed icon, and it's over here in this TSX file. The component itself is social embed, and we can take a look at that if we need to. It just has some really basic sort of TypeScript that's written up that we're going to go ahead and use for the element itself. Element type, so I can go ahead and just continue to type these. So we talked about the 4 elements earlier, right? So we said that we had our block type, we had our void type, we have an option to choose from a few others as well. So inline or text, and for this plugin, we only really need block and void. So we're not going to use anything else, but as you can see here, because we've actually already instantiated the SDK, we now have the option to select any of the 4 element types that we want to use. I'll go ahead and just kind of collapse that. We have display on, and so there's a couple display on options here as well. So we have really 2 options for ourselves. We have the toolbar, which is basically the standard sort of across the top toolbar. And then we have a hovering toolbar, which is actually kind of cool. And so we'll keep it at toolbar for now. But I'll kind of demo the hovering toolbar. It's not super helpful for a social embed function, but it is kind of cool because you can actually then declare your RTE or your plugin to be available in the floating toolbar, and that will basically follow the user around as they're highlighting text or highlighting objects and trying to use the functionality there. Awesome. And now we come on to next effect. This is kind of step 4, and I can grab both of these at once, which is fine. And step 4 is basically define the interactivity of our plugin. So I mentioned that before, during the slide deck, and basically talking about specifically what the plugin is supposed to do. So basically here, we've basically dropped in some standard code that now the plugin exists. So we defined that in step number 3. We actually created the plugin and defined some configuration options for the plugin. Now we have to basically tell it how to behave, tell it what to interact with and how to interact. So I want to define the interactivity. And we already have the components that we created earlier. So we have basically a social embed plugin or component, I should say. We have our embed icon, which is actually using an icon from our Venus component library, which was used to build the new experience itself. And then we have our social embed modal, and we'll take a look at exactly how this ultimately functions. But for the purposes of saving a little bit of time for this demo, we want to go ahead and basically, so what we did is basically attach an on click listener event so that when it executes, it'll go ahead and call up that modal and basically provide a small input field to allow the user to drop in a URL, which will then render accordingly for our embed functionality. And then we get to step number 5. And oops. And step 5 is basically just to return the plugin. And for us, we called it social embed plugin. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop that in there. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And because again, I have Webpack basically bundling everything for me, you'll see it was compiled, ignore the warnings. But now what we can do is over here, and I basically defined this and hosted it just locally because this is all client side. And so I don't have to actually host this on a sort of a public web server. I can just do it locally, and you'll see we do have a running app right now. We come back to Contentstack. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to extensions, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new extension. So create new. You notice I do have a new option here for RTE plugin. So I'm going to go ahead and create, again, this extension, which exists as a plugin. Two things you'll notice. So one thing, of course, we do have our, we'll say, social embed. And I think actually we'll make it a little bit more specific. We'll call it Twitter embed. The second thing you'll notice here as well is we're only providing at this point for this these plugins an external URL. The reason for that is that basically because what we are building effectively is a small React app. If we were to provide, basically an inline sort of editor where you can drop in a whole bunch of basically an entire file system or an HTML document like the other extensions were, which are basically just iframes, there would be a whole lot of additional things that would have to function that the app would have to know about. Whereas if we just compile it on our side, all we have to do is present a some usable JavaScript to the client, and then it'll basically function from there. And so what we're going to be enforcing here, and you'll hear actually a bit more about this coming up very soon, and ways that we're going to help developers to actually develop and host their own plugins. But we're going to be basically recommending that the majority of these are hosted externally. And in this case, it's just going to be with my local host. And so I'm just going to grab this URL. It's going to be available to my plugin. Save that. Now we'll come back to our content type. And so, as I said before, I have basically a single content type that is, I'm calling demo RT here. And I'm just going to go ahead and open the properties tab for this JSON rich text editor. One thing you'll notice here is that in the properties tab, I do have the option to select an extension. So I just created that Twitter embed. We'll go ahead and grab that Twitter embed extension. And that's basically going to add an additional toolbar element to the RT itself. If I go into advanced, I can basically see, some custom options here. But basically all I need to do is select the extension from basic, and I've gone ahead and done that. Okay, now we'll jump back into the entry that I had created earlier. So you'll notice, or you'll remember that it was basically just a single entry with a single item. And one thing you will see here is that we did have some basic text. I've added now a social embed functionality that didn't previously exist. If you caught it, it just kind of popped up right after it loaded. And as soon as I kind of go ahead and do that, I now have the ability to drop in an embed URL. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a tweet from the Mock Alliance for Nick Barron's talk, which I think was on Monday, I believe. And yeah, it was on Monday. And I'm just going to go ahead and drop that in here, add that. And that should give us nicely basically our embedded tweet, which basically also contains just some of the intro text for his talk. I'll go ahead and save that. And what we actually did as well, just to kind of finally show this as a real live, in fact, demo, is we just kind of pop this into just a really basic little sort of little hello world app. It was previously only fetching the title, as you can see here, as well as the basic sort of body text. So a tour, most loved content for commerce. And if I go ahead and refresh this page, it should now bring in that tweet. And here we go. So this is the exact the tweet that I just grabbed from Twitter. I embedded it within this rich text editor plugin that I am calling Social Embed, that was built basically from scratch. And I've referred it as a custom extension to this RT itself. And that takes us right at the top of the half hour, actually. So I'm going to jump back to our deck and do one final share. Awesome. And so as we can see here, I kind of just did I have this also stood up. There's several instances of this for us to do development on. This is also stood up on a separate application, and some of our customers and internal folks have seen this, where I kind of just can show side by side very quickly the preview versus the JSON. On the left here, we basically have the RT preview, so what the rendered sort of experience is effectively in HTML. versus the JSON on the right-hand side here, which you'll see is basically 2 blocks. And so the first block is type paragraph. And I just kind of dropped in a little a block right above this. It says a pretty neat embedded tweet. And basically, as you can see here, that is the text for it. We have an ID. You'll see some dirty attributes. That's sort of a future-looking thing for an eventual autosave functionality. And then we basically have our type embed Twitter. So this was basically recreated. I think the type is a little bit different than what the type I created. It doesn't really matter. I just defined it with a different sort of name. It's the exact same code running it. Basically, it's going to contain our attributes, which we talked about earlier. So we have our ID, we have our type, element type, we have our, which is a custom type now. We have our attributes. So we have our tweet ID, we have our URL. And then we basically have, if there was any text here, there is, but this is kind of a void type, so the text is not necessary. And then basically we have a document, which is going to give us the ID of the entire JSON document, which is containing these blocks. And so that's basically what it would look like in JSON as it's being stored. And it's exactly as I talked about earlier when we were outlining and defining the plugin itself. So now what kind of plugins can be built? So there's really kind of 5 main categories of plugins that you could build here. The first one is to manipulate data. So that would be things like adding some stylistic attributes. So your font family, your font size, your font color. And we have examples and development environments that have this as well. If, typically, specifically on these back-end headless systems, they're generally not responsible for stylistic attributes. And there's a lot of really good reasons for that. But in fact, if you did want to provide your editors the ability and your users the ability to modify something stylistically within your style sheet on the front end, you can in fact create some plugins to do that. And that's totally fine. It's not just about formatting. It can also be about styles. And so the ability to sort of manipulate some of that data by adding these attributes is really handy. You could also listen for example, like restricted keywords. That might be a way to manipulate data. So you can, in fact, disallow a user to write a specific keyword. If you're Pepsi, you don't want to allow anyone to say Coke, then you can go ahead and maybe disallow that as a restricted keyword. Of course, you can generate some new data. So things like emojis. So we have an emojis plugin that we also kind of developed internally, and it's just basically it's going to drop in net new data that wasn't previously available for users to create. It is not by default, of course. You can always copy and paste it, but basically the plugin itself is responsible just as an emojis picker. Add custom attributes to data. And so these are things like really helpful for localization, for personalization. So if you wanted the ability for users to tag certain strings or blocks or different element types with some attributes, they don't really actually make a visual difference to the user when they're actually creating and editing the content. But on the back end, it's going to be sent down on request with some attributes that represent either some personalization attributes that might help there, or some localization attributes. And so if you want to have some strings be translated, some strings not be translated, some strings to have a particular value that might be represented from like a structured taxonomy, or some sort of variable. So let's say if the actual string itself is tagged as a variable, it might mean one thing to the user as they're creating their custom rich text in Contentstack, but then when it's being sent down to your front end, it actually might render as something completely different, right? And that basically is defined by the variable that the user is setting there. You might have some meta features, and so these are things like religious enhancements to the overall functionality of the JSON RTE. So that's things like word count or character count, right? So that's not really affecting the actual data itself. It's really just like adding an additional enhancement on top of the base functionality of the rich text editor itself. And finally, you might have integration for some third-party apps. And so you can think of like dropping in dashboards, dropping in forms, dropping in embeds, from social, for example, dropping in things like Jira tickets. And so if you want the ability for a user to basically pull in, if they drop in a URL from Jira, actually render that as a full-blown Jira ticket right in line. There's a lot of different things that can happen here with a plugin architecture, and a lot of integrations that can be made possible from your third-party apps just by defining that and setting that up with a plugin itself. Okay, so those are basically the 5 general types of plugins that can be built. There's a lot of really interesting use cases and tons of functionality here that's available to users. And that's it. So you saw basically a quick demo of the new Contentstack experience, and then we dove a little bit deeper into our new rich text editor itself, which is rendering native JSON, and then basically the ability to create a plugin directly in the RTE, which we're really excited about. Thanks very much for listening.